Okay, well, welcome to another episode of the Rest and Recovery Podcast. With me is Awais Spall, and he is a functional medicine practitioner from Venice, California. And before becoming a health practitioner, Awais had formulation, chemist, consulting, and so that's an important background when it comes to functional health. And moved on and used his background in Ayurvedic herbalism to open up your current practice at Integrative Oasis. So welcome to the Rest and Recovery Podcast.
Thank you, Scott. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's always good to connect with folks, in the functional space, as a recent FDN-P, and you're a graduate as well, to learn where people have been and what they've been doing with their practices and the uniqueness of it. And, I really like your background, or where your focus is, I should say, which is, the microbiome. And there, there's a lot of conversation around that. And we were talking offline, the nuances in gut health, right, as a broad category. But, before we kind of dig into the specifics, maybe give a little background on yourself. I know you ran into some health challenges about a decade or so ago, and how you got to this point.
Yeah, definitely. So, starting with around like 2011, 2010, I'm a young adult, right? I was exercising a lot, I was working out, and I started having this just chronic pain developing in my front shoulders, and then these weird spastic sensations all throughout my back that started to spread.
Hmm.
It was strange. I couldn't make out what was going on. Went to the doctors. They were like, "This is, just put some ice on it, take some ibuprofen." They put me on a prescription of Tylenol number 3 with codeine. They were like, "Take this twice a day." I was
Oh,
like,
wow.
"I'm certainly not going to do that. That sounds insane."
Yeah.
So I found different doctors, and I discovered a doctor that did Prolo PRP, and we built a strong relationship, and he just became sort of a friend and a mentor, and he could see that I was really into medicine. He was really curious about sort of my family's background, and eventually he starts treating me for free and or at cost, and he gives me the super secret NBA stack, which I thought I was curious what that was, and he mentioned something called peptides. And mind you, this is around 12, 13 years ago.
Yeah.
So this sounded really futuristic then. And he started giving me printouts on different peptides, GH peptides, healing peptides. And he's like, they're used all over the world. And, it's going to be a big thing in the US. So this sort of planted the bug in me and kind of guided my path. And then over the years, going through various different sorts of health challenges, right? Mold exposure, different challenges to my microbiome, SIBO, various sorts of fungal issues, and just sort of learning how to heal those, right? Like I
Yeah.
started training in various functional medicine programs, FDN, among others. And through that, I was able to access my own healing and sort of see sort of what's working, what's really efficient. And I started tapping into my grandfather's legacy in
Okay.
the Ayurvedic canon.
Okay.
And that was just so interesting to explore that as an adult, right? Like growing up, you hear about it and it just feels so like old and old school and kind of woo woo, and it's just like I'm like, no, I'm a scientist, like that's my personality. I'm a science guy. I like hard science.
Yeah.
And kind of tapping into the wisdom, the deeper wisdom of Ayurveda really helped me see that that's the legacy that you know I want to honor, is of the as an alchemist of the healing arts. So that just became really important to me.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that, leaning back, because we look back at old ways of doing things without the quote unquote science, and blow it off immediately because they didn't know better. But in many cases, they did know better. They just didn't have the systems to prove out the science.
Hmm.
Exactly. And that, but the science also helps discredit some of the things that were maybe not applicable. But so maybe explain, for those listening, and even for my benefit, a little bit more about what Ayurvedic, no, hopefully I pronounced that right, medicine is, or herbalism, maybe a 101 explanation of what it is and how it can be supportive.
Yes, absolutely. So Ayurveda, when it's defined, means to discover the truth of your life, right? So it's all about that personalized approach. And there's various constitutions, there's various doshas, there's three major elements, that is Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. Vata is air and ether, Pitta is fire, and then Kapha is earth and water. And those three constitutions make up the seasons, the environment, food, our own bodies. We have a doshic constitution, and we can use these principles to balance our bodies. And then when we can also use them to assess when our bodies are sort of in a state of imbalance.
Hmm.
So you are a strong fire type. You have a lot of fire, pitta energy in you. And you also have some of that earthy groundedness that comes kapha as well. So you have a really nice blend of those two elements that might not have been how you always were.
Right.
You might have been more, you might have had some years when you were really pitta and really just fiery, so you have that
Interesting.
really nice balance. And then, from a nutritional perspective, from a imbalance perspective, that can lead to certain things. If you were like purely that pitta type, there's pitta related disorders, and
Mm.
then pittas are attracted to certain types of things, right? So I think now in regenerative and functional medicine, we're really coming back to this theme of precision medicine, right?
Yeah.
Like individualizing based on genomics. So I like to think of Ayurveda as the first system of personalized medicine and the personalized approach to your well-being. Also, there's a big component of purpose and processing emotions in the Ayurvedic canon. So just like you're digesting food, toxins, you're also digesting emotional products as well.
Yeah.
And I love that concept because you can have a backup of emotions and they can show up in your physiology. You can be without purpose, right? You can be disconnected from your highest self, from your highest purpose. That can manifest as many things in your body as well. So that's where I love the sort of blending of mind, body, and spirit in Ayurveda.
Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty fascinating. I think, you can hear echoes in other, I'll call it natural or medicines that come from different parts of the world around the same time, but didn't cross paths per se and have similar, right? A lot of times hear about Chinese medicine, or even just naturopathic in general, those similar uh, methodologies of just, I think, rooted in really just understanding how your body functions and understanding what I call the dashboard lights mean and how to respond to them properly.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and every system had their own sort of quote unquote dashboard lights.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out, what's kind of off. And then what I liked about what you said is, on how to, like, if you had a certain balance, you gave the description of, I forget the terms, but like if you're whatever you're in, if you have a tendency in that moment, how to best support or balance that so it's not out of whack, so to speak.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the doshas.
Noxious. Okay. That's pretty fascinating. So you mentioned, you know, around, or the implication of stress, right? And how we can get out of balance. And that is, I'll call it a precursor, it seems, to, a lot of dysfunction or dysbiosis in our bodies and around the gut health. Maybe dig into that on the relationship of maybe stress and the gut.
Yeah, absolutely. So in Ayurveda, they refer to the microbiome as these invisible forces. So many Ayurvedic historians and scholars believe that they kind of look at that language use and that history of these like invisible sort of things that are existing in the body, that they're on a microscopic level, that they were kind of in tune with the fact that a microbiome exists in the body and that we ought to nourish it, right?
Okay.
So what's the relationship of stress to this microbiome from that perspective? Well, stress can come in many forms, right? And that's what sort of we talk about as FDNs, and it's very, very similar. You can have stress from endotoxins, right? Byproducts of bacterial toxins or byproducts of fungi, mold living in the body, right? They excrete these biotoxins, endotoxins. You can have that burden building up in the body, and that can be quite stressful, right? So it's like
Right.
if you had in your gut right now one of these endotoxins called lipopolysaccharide, and it's kind of overburdening your immune system, you could feel physically stressed. You could feel physically anxious because we know that they throw off the neurotransmitter chemistry. We know that they bind to certain anxiolytic receptors in the brain and that they can cross the blood-brain barrier, right?
Okay.
So we know that a lot of your neurotransmitters are made in your gut, right? So I
Right.
like to think about this idea that like the sort of monk, what's the monk gut, right? Like you look at that really, really peaceful meditator and you can just see that natural glowing smile on their face, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yes, that's cultivated via practice, but also there's some microbes that take you there, right? There's some microbes that produce GABA, right? A very important calming, restful neurotransmitter, right? And
Right.
if you have those microbes that are making GABA and you're feeling that calm state, it's bi-directional. It's gonna give you that sort of state so that you can access those higher states of being. You can live calm, collected, present, right? So I think many people in some of these canons, they really try to get to stress from like, oh, it's my mindset, it's my psychology, it's my programming. I need to do meditation, I need to do this thing, I need to reduce this type of stressful thinking. But some
Right.
of that stress is also coming from the gut itself.
Hmm.
So I think
Right.
that's sort of an important component here.
So it's like kind of bi-directional, right? I guess maybe like, yeah, it got started, maybe the chicken and egg scenario of where the stress is coming from. Uh,
Mm-hmm,
maybe
mm-hmm.
external and or cognitive, but it eventually then comes into the gut and then it just sets there and then it's kind of going back and forth.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. So when it comes to like, you know, the microbiome, a lot of times I've heard gut, right? And I'm sure most people listening are familiar with that aspect of it. But I've been hearing a lot lately on some other podcasts and just my own research that there's microbiome and other aspects of our body that we're discovering. Um, and maybe expound on some of those other domains of biome, I guess you can call it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have many microbiomes all across the body, right? And that kind of forms sort of the singular biome, right? There's a Scott biome, there's an Awais biome, right? But the research on these various biomes are showing certain keystone species, what species dictate a healthy X microbiome. So some of the most important ones are your oral, your sinus biome, because if you think about it, you're swallowing spit all day, right?
Right.
You're swallowing saliva. Some of the nasal drip is going into your throat, and you're kind of that's always going to be going straight into your gut. Not a lot from your gut goes straight into your nose, into your mouth. And that's where I think the oral microbiome has been this sort of secret revolution over the past decade or so, where the American Heart Association, these medical organizations are acknowledging the role of certain oral microbes in causing heart disease, in their role in causing plaque formation, right?
Oh,
And and that's just one example, right? But there's so many ways the oral microbiome contributes to our total body burden of toxins. And also we kind of shine the light on these when there's a problem, right? Like, what is a bad oral microbiome, right?
Right.
Well, that's when you have plaque forming, and then you can have anaerobic bacteria living in that plaque. You can have sort of periodontal disease, which is different microbes that are throwing off the pH balance of your gums,
Mm.
right? And then that can cause some halitosis, that can cause bad breath. Many people dealing with mold can have those pH balances thrown off in their mouth. And many naturopaths, you can talk to them and they'll tell you that they can often smell that in someone's mouth. So
Wow.
those are some examples of the ways that the oral sort of microbiome can be thrown off. Well, what is an optimal oral microbiome, right?
Right. What's the
It doesn't
definition of success, right?
exactly. So what are some of these keystone species that are healthy in our oral microbiome, right? And like there's companies trying to use these to make like oral probiotic like toothpaste and stuff like that. And there's also there's lots of sort of innovation in that area. Like, how can we get the microbiome to function optimally? I don't think we've really discovered a set of like keystone bacterial species that
Yeah.
are really fundamental, like we have in like the colon and our like primary quote unquote microbiome. But I think a huge component of a healthy microbiome is, in fact, the absence of these problematic components, right? If you're
Right.
able to remove those components, you're kind of reducing a major component of the burden on the gut. Same thing with the sinus microbiome. There's lots of in the sinus microbiome, we have a strain called Lactobacillus sacchi,
Okay.
which is really important, which kind of is regulatory. It's preventing the colonization of mold, of fungi, of viruses in the sinuses. And then the sinuses, for example, when you have mold exposure or you just have an imbalance, what will happen is biofilm will start to grow, and underneath the biofilm, you'll have many colonies of these different things. And it can be a really prominent hidden burden
Yeah.
that people are not aware of. And you know, your podcast is called Rest and Recovery. And a pattern I've seen clinically is it'll throw off the sinus microbiome will throw off sleep in such a way that people have a hard time detecting that. And because it's just dumping endotoxins all night long. And then, you know, they'll be taking like liposomal GABA, liposomal CBD,
Yeah.
melatonin suppositories, you know, sometimes being on prescription sleep drugs and just all kinds of stuff. And it doesn't do much to move the needle. We'll clear out the sinus microbiome like burden, the toxin burden there, the mold, the bacteria. Boom. All of a sudden, you know, sleep
Things.
is just dynamo, rest and recovery is just optimal, right? So
Yeah.
that's where I've kind of started getting passionate about these auxiliary microbiomes, which are not auxiliary at all.
Yeah. They may seem like it, but it sounds like it's still in the primary of like the one A, B, and C of importance.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So uh, one thing you mentioned, or maybe you can expound upon the sinus piece. You know, it kind of makes sense if you're maybe systemically congested. Well, let me put a pause on that. Let me go back to one other thing around the awareness. So you mentioned a few things. It probably sounds newer to most folks. How do you become aware if that is something you need to look further into, or come to someone like yourself to explore?
So it's all about history, right? Like some people listening to this might be thinking, I'm having sinus issues, you know, that explains my congestion. That might be the cause. And they're kind of like the light bulbs going off right now, and they're thinking, wait a second, I had that mold exposure, and then I've had these latent sinus issues, and maybe that's where kind of like my lingering symptoms are coming from, right?
Okay.
There
Right.
is testing that can be done. The Marcons testing, Marcons refers to an antibiotic resistant staph. The testing for Marcons, it's very similar to like the viral test where they stick that Q-tip deep into your nose, and it feels like it's like cleaning your brain out, but it's just in your sinuses. So That test will actually give you clues as to what's happening fungally because they also give you a fungal report as well. There's also, Mayo Clinic data that shows that if you have sinusitis, there's a strong chance you have fungal issues in your sinuses. And fungi are not really commensal, meaning they're not really supposed to be in the sinuses, right?
Okay.
So those are some clues. Something that I will sometimes do is I'll refer someone out to an ozone clinic or an ozone practice, and they'll do sort of a low dose ozone into the sinuses like nasal insufflation.
Okay.
And some people will not have a reaction to that, but people who've had this burden, they'll have like a really severe reaction. And then we know that it's not you that's reacting, it's the microbes that are reacting, right? And then
Gotcha.
we build a protocol, a treatment plan to kind of start addressing that. And then it's amazing to see when we tone that microbiome down, and kind of like stabilize the sinuses and sinus health, people sleep better, their breathing is so much better, right?
Yeah.
Because this is also where you're getting oxygen. This is the filtration, right? We know that this is where nitric oxide is produced as well, right? In
Right.
the turbinate. Most of your nitric oxide is produced in the turbinate and your oral microbiome, right? So these are really, really important things. And when that pH balance is thrown off, when that toxin burden is kind of elevated, it'll throw both these things off, and it just makes you feeling, as my uh, airway orthodontic dentist says, makes you feel just lousy.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes sense because, like, if you're not getting the nitric oxide, you're probably getting an insufficient balance of oxygen in your blood. That's going to probably correlate to fatigue, not just because your sleep is poor, but it's both and, I guess, of, the reduced quality of sleep. And then I would think just even when you are breathing effectively, it's not producing the same level of quality air that then aids your energy management.
Exactly.
You know, I don't know if this is a rabbit hole I want to jump down, but I've got a theory on certain sicknesses, specifically the one that came up a couple years ago, and how that really messed up a lot of people, including myself, the sinus cavities, where a lot of people were losing sense of smell, things like that. I really wonder if that had a major effect on microbiome and the quality of the oxygen. Like, is it affecting nitric oxide intake, things like that, if you're dealing with those, and maybe a corollary to long COVID?
Mm. That's so relevant. That's sort of this is sort of when I think the sinus microbiome really started getting on people's radars with these recent viral things and the quote unquote long viral stuff, right? You can have long viral stuff with any viral issue. It just kind of started getting attention with sort of our recent pandemic.
Yeah.
And and yes, what pattern we saw with COVID was it sort of proliferated sinus fungal issues in people. And the patterns were so obvious that I'm blown away that mainstream medicine just missed it. People were showing up with just white tongues, right? They were showing up with thrush. And doctors were commenting on it. They were saying, like allopathic physicians, and saying that this is kind of insignificant. It's just kind of like a temporary response in the body. Well, no, it's not. Like that is a part of sort of what's happening. And the pathway as to how the virus kind of leads to the fungal issues is definitely like I've thought through that a few times, and I think like it definitely has to do with the coagulopathy in the blood, sort of the vascular sort of issues that that viruses in general can cause.
Right.
And then that creates the conditions for the fungal stuff, and it just kind of brings out, it tips the fungal stuff a little over the edge. It's the right environment for them, and that's part of what causes symptomology.
Hmm.
So people that I've worked with that'll do a really deep sort of fungal protocol, an antifungal protocol, they'll get a viral incident and their recovery is so much faster. And I think there is a relationship between all microbes and how they proliferate each other. And I think that's where, with the recent stuff, the science has become really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I'd like to dig into that further at some point. Uh,
Hmm.
but it's definitely interesting. Um, so how does this correlate to other aspects like cognitive function, other maybe symptomatic things that we would want to look at to kind of peel back the onion and get better awareness for ourselves?
Testing is so important, right? And the some of the most important testing for me is qPCR testing of the gut to look at the pathogen overgrowth, to look
Mm.
at the microbes. There's a ton of debate on what the right analytic methodology is to test the gut, right? I know someone might be listening to this and there's I'm more into whole genome, or I'm into 18S, or this methodology, right? Or like I thought this was the best. Why are you talking about qPCR, which is partial sequencing? Well, it's clinically correlated very, very well for me
Okay.
in my practice, in my work, and different methodologies may be working for, you know, different people in different contexts. But that's something, but regardless, I think, adjacent, like regardless of the methodology, I think testing is critical.
Yeah.
That gives us a picture. As far as testing for leaky gut, I know there's various methods for that. The one that I've been gravitating towards recently is blood testing to look at LPS and other endotoxins in the blood. And
Interesting.
that will correlate. So that's the burden, right? That's the problem with leaky gut that causes. So when we look at that, it can kind of point us towards the inflammatory load that's caused by the gut. And then
Okay.
we can quite literally in real time watch that go down with retesting as we're able to build up that membrane layer, as we're able to do those antimicrobial protocols and kind of remove those burdens, build up that membrane, and then watch sort of the gut restore itself. So, as far as the tools, the most important thing that's going to get anybody feeling better in any context in functional medicine is removing the problem, right?
Okay.
People ask me what's the best nootropic for my brain. I want to focus. I'm like, the best thing for your brain is removing the problems that are accessing your brain, right?
Right.
Aluminum, glyphosate, you know, PFAS, all these environmental toxins, all these bacterial toxins that are made in your body, right? Like restore that kind of like function in your body. You'll watch your neurological function go up. But once we've kind of hit that baseline, we've started removing the bad stuff. There's some incredible psychobiotics
Mm.
that are on the market. There's some, and this is kind of like a new area, the psychobiome, the relationship between the gut microbiome and neurological health. And that's through these microbes that make neurotransmitters that cross the blood-brain barrier. Again, this is one of those things where, like, when you really start looking at the science, we don't know the exact pathway. There's some research that's indicating that the microbes, these psychobiotics, can actually directly communicate with the vagal nerve through the gut axis. And that's a big component of the gut brain axis, right?
Okay.
So that's fascinating to me
Yeah.
that there's a direct sort of nervous system communication. And then, this kind of like goes towards John Leaf's work around cellular communication, and that the cells of our body are as intelligent, they're incredibly intelligent. They have culture, they have, these communication systems. It's not just the microbes are communicating with our own cells. So I think we don't have a clear theory on how this happens. We just know that the psychobiotics are really critical. And to give you a real world example of how that shows up, kimchi has many microbes, healthy microbes in it, and that some of the organic acid concentrations produce GABA. And
Hmm.
this is why like consuming kimchi at night can sometimes give people better sleep. It's not just that it's those sort of acids and organic acids are improving gut motility, they're improving digestion, but there's quite literally an increase in GABA production there. And there's research on this. If you go down this rabbit hole, it's like, do do Koreans have better GABA production? Are they getting better sleep because of this?
Right.
Um, and uh, and yeah, I think it's a super interesting question.
That's pretty interesting. Because I've always heard, kimchi is supposed to be good for your gut. It could depend on the individual, but it's a new nighttime snack, I guess, to have some kimchi before you go to bed.
Yeah, right. I mean, it just depends, right? Like there's also a lot of histamine in it. So for some people that their histamine bucket may be full already, so it may be kind of like could make them itchy or kind of take their H2 receptors like over the top and they're almost agitated from consuming it.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people that are kind of have that healthy histamine balance, I think kimchi at night, definitely like with dinner, it's a nice fermented food. Lots of fermented foods do these interesting sort of have these interesting biochemical pathways that are doing incredible neurological things.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. And I think, there's a real important nuance for those listening that you mentioned the histamine element to it and the fact that, sometimes from a nutritional standpoint, we can say something is good for you. Um, it's a general assessment, but when it's applied to your personal chemistry, it may not be, right? Um, and it's an important nuance that, all of us, including myself, have done in the past. It's like, oh, certain things are good for me, so I eat it and then I don't feel great. So it's like you have to, that I think circles back to the foundation, which is really that awareness factor of how your body responds to things and what those catalysts are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, we're kind of creeping up on time, but what's something that I haven't asked yet that's really an important detail, especially for those just discovering or learning about their health and understanding their microbiome better. What's maybe a strategy or a tactic to uh, kind of that first domino, I'll call it.
That's a great question. And I think if there's one thing people are listening that I'd love for them to walk away from, it's how can you actually optimize the microbiome, right? What is that first domino? I love that framing that can sort of tip everything over it and lead you to that positive cycle, right?
Right.
Also psychologically, there's a thing with health optimization and health protocols, right? As practitioners, we see sort of the things that lead to success, and it's like you gotta get the first domino going, and you kind of like create that positive cycle, and then that gets people hooked, and then you kind of want to keep going, right?
Right.
You want to keep feeling better. So I think it's the dominant sort of microbial imbalance. It's kind of like restoring that, right? I think like using that right combo of antimicrobials once sort of detox pathways, drainage pathways are opened up, right? We can't remove endotoxins. We can't remove sort of bacterial, microbial biotoxins if the detox and drainage is not open, right? So assuming detox and drainage has been opened appropriately, there's so many methods to do this. Every practitioner has a different philosophy for this.
Mm-hmm.
But once that's happening, I think the next critical component is addressing that sort of first order of microbial toxin. And that can be different for different people, right? Parasite, viral, bacterial, fungal, right? Which one is it in your case? That's where it has to be a precision approach as to what is your dominant, like sort of overgrowth imbalance. And then I think when we spend a few weeks targeting that one or two combo, right? Eventually you want to get to everything, right? Eventually you want to kind of like clear everything out. And that's kind of the the art and science of microbiome medicine. That's what I've been training in over the past like 5, 6 years, in depth, is how do we structure these microbiome protocols and interventions, and how do we think about that phasing. But when we, for example, if you had a mold history that's led to some fungal stuff, right? We know that there's some viral stuff in there too, because that's often a contributor to the chronic fatigue.
Mhm.
And in your initial kind of domino protocol, for the first few weeks, we just focus on the fungal detoxification, the fungal antimicrobials, and some nice antiviral botanicals. Doing that for a few weeks, it's gonna get you to feeling better, right?
Right.
It's a nice feeling in the body. A lot of us kind of started this work because we dealt with these health issues. I know what that feels like, to take your fungal burden down. You feel better. It's hard to even describe. You feel like a more clear channel. You feel more aligned. You feel happier. Your
Yeah.
nose feels better. You're breathing better. Your mouth feels better. You wake up feeling more refreshed. You just keep on feeling better. And I think that is so important, to know what your unique first domino is, and kind of like getting to that with whatever way you do is a really important part of re-establishing, reconditioning your microbiome and getting you to feeling better.
Awesome. I think that's really, really helpful and just a good practical, first step for folks to really start to work the process. So, Awais, I really appreciate your time. I like to close things out with a few personal questions, nothing too heavy. But what are you reading right now?
Ooh, really, really good question. What am I reading right now? Let me think about this. What do I have in my stack? So I just read, I've read Ben Lynch's Dirty Genes before in the
Hmm.
past, but I just reread it. I wanted to freshen up on some of the genomics, the personal sort of interventions, and I find it always really interesting to look at those prominent gene SNPs, how they're showing up. And also our research is constantly evolving, right?
Yeah,
So I wanted to look at it with a fresh pair of eyes. That's like, what does the research today say about these gene SNPs? And I found it to be pretty relevant. So that's Dirty Genes by Ben Lynch.
yeah. Great book. I've not completed it, but I do have it. It's on this bookshelf back here.
Amazing.
So, all right, what are you listening to right now, be it music or podcast?
Podcast wise, I'm a huge fan of Natalie Needham's podcast.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
had
find
her
that
on.
to be, yeah, I love Natalie. She's a friend, and just it's such a refreshing perspective in biohacking. And yeah, I really appreciate her, and that's something I listen to quite a bit.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a
yeah.
great one for, especially she digs a lot into the peptide realm
Mm-hmm.
of things.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
she's wonderful. All right, last one. What is your go-to rest and recovery method?
Mm. Some of my favorite tools are, I enjoy tech. I'm not, I know that some people like to do everything analog, but I enjoy some tech. I got it right here, the Pulsetto. I've been playing around with this. I don't know. I'm definitely not sponsored by them. I don't know if it's something that I'm gonna keep.
Yeah,
Maybe I'll return it, maybe I'll keep it. But I'm monitoring my sleep with the sleep program on it, and seeing how that kind of gets my body ready for sleep, just with the polyvagal stimulation.
cool.
And then the other two tools that I love for sleep are liposomal GABA
Okay.
and liposomal CBD. And those are just by Quicksilver Scientific. That's the brand I prefer. And those just get my body, in a state of rest. And definitely, I always do a nasal flush before going to sleep. And that I've noticed is a really important part of my sleep quality. And with this whole sleep stack that I just shared, that gets me sleeping anywhere. I can sleep on a plane, I can sleep in a hotel room. So that's been like my go-to sleep stack.
Cool, cool. I'll have to check that one out. Uh, so, well, Oasis, man, I really appreciate your insights on, you know, really digging into this. I'll call it newer, but the microbiome and how important that is, and how that cascades throughout our whole body and can really affect our health. So, how can folks locate you or find you on the intrawebs?
Amazing. So you can, I'm pretty accessible on Instagram. My handle is pretty simple. It's my practice integrative oasis, and that's it. Like integrative medicine, oasis, like the oasis of the desert, you know. So integrative oasis. You can find me there, and you can just send me a DM, and I'd be happy to sort of chat. And if you're interested in sort of working with me, I work a lot. We didn't talk about peptides at all, which is great. Kind of focus on the microbiome, but I do work with various peptides and those sorts of tools as well. So
Cool.
yeah, feel free to reach
Awesome.
out.
All right, great, man. Well, thank you so much. Be well.
All right, thank you so much, Scott. This was a lot of fun.